This video series provides a summary of the scientific findings that were presented in the first half of my book, The Hidden Truth, a logical path through compelling evidence to discover the nature of reality and the meaning of life. Each video in the series summarizes one chapter from my book, but the entirety of the evidence is far too expansive to fit in a short video series. So the purpose of this video series then is not to present all of the evidence, but to provide you with a summary containing enough information to make an informed decision about whether reading my book to learn the rest of the story would be worth your valuable time. As I've noted in my blog on WordPress, the most valuable commodity any of us possesses is time. We conclude this video series with evidence on reincarnation, which builds upon evidence previously presented in the fields of quantum physics, near-death experiences, and out-of-body experiences in videos 1 through 3. I encourage you to start with those 3 videos if you haven't seen them already, and then refer to my blog for more information about my book, as well as advanced topics presented for those who've read the book in full and are interested in taking the research another step further. A belief in reincarnation is common amongst Eastern religions and cultures, but many Western religions also have historical traditions and sects that incorporated reincarnation in their canon. Mainstream Islam, for example, does not accept the precept of reincarnation, but certain Shiite sects do. They point towards passages in the Quran that imply the validity of reincarnation, such as this statement from the Quran Surah, "And Allah hath caused you to spring forth from the earth like a plant. Hereafter will He turn you back into it again, and will bring you forth anew." Judaism also has minority sects that continue to believe in reincarnation, such as Kabbalah. The Zohar, a central text of Kabbalah from the mystical tradition of Judaism, states, "The souls must re-enter the Absolute from whence they have emerged, but to accomplish this end they must develop all the perfections, the germ of which is planted in them, and if they have not fulfilled this condition during one life, they must commence another, a third, and so on until they have acquired the condition which fits them for reunion with God." Ancient Judaism, dating before the 1st century AD, had a much wider acceptance of reincarnation, which influenced early Christians to accept that a cycle of rebirth could only be transcended by following the teachings and inspiration of Jesus of Nazareth. Judaism's Torah and Christianity's Old Testament asserted, for example, that Elijah would reappear before the coming of the Messiah. In the Christian Gospel, according to Matthew chapter 11, Jesus identified John the Baptist as being Elijah reborn. Thus, Jesus asserted the passage from the Jewish Holy Book had been fulfilled through Elijah's rebirth as John. Failure to accept the validity of Elijah having been reborn as John would also undermine the claim that Jesus was the Messiah, thus showing both early Christians and Jews, since Jesus was a Jew, believed in reincarnation. Indeed, a belief in reincarnation continued in the theology of Christianity for centuries. One of the most prolific writers about Christian theology, the Catholic priest Origen, who lived around 200 AD, was an ardent proponent of reincarnation. Origen could not believe a just and loving God would create humans and then summarily condemn them to eternal damnation if they had not lived righteously, no matter their life circumstances. Origen believed in the precept of universal salvation and reincarnation as the primary tool for humans to work through spiritual evolutionary issues from one life to the next, much like the Eastern religions of the modern day. However, believers in reincarnation stood as impediments to the Catholic Church's absolute authority. Those early Christians who believed in reincarnation were neither induced by promises of heavenly bliss, nor intimidated by the priest's threats of hellfire in the afterlife. By inference, they did not need ordained Catholic priests to administer sacramental rites such as confession and the forgiveness of sins in order to earn eternal rewards in the hereafter. Their spiritual self-reliance was abhorrent to Catholic leaders, as their subservience could not be guaranteed. The early church leaders needed power and influence, and such self-reliant believers in reincarnation were thus antithetical to the Church Fathers' objectives and had to be excised, therefore, from the Church by any means necessary. In the year 553 AD, Roman Emperor Justinian called the Fifth Ecumenical Council to rectify early Christian teachings into a single universally accepted theology. 15 teachings were declared anathema and heresy as a result of that council, including the concept of the preexistence of souls and reincarnation. However, belief in reincarnation did not merely die because of Justinian's council. Rather, the belief had to be forcibly rooted out and purged, as it was accomplished through the Inquisition's use of organized torture and state-sanctioned terror. Through such, the Inquisition sought to frighten people into following approved Catholic orthodoxy as nonconformers were systematically tortured and killed by the hundreds of thousands in order to achieve the state and church-sanctioned goal. Still, it took almost 300 years before the Inquisition almost successfully rooted out the connection to and belief in reincarnation from Christianity and Western culture by extension. Since then, reincarnation has survived only on the fringes of Western society, a concept understood but generally discarded from plausible acceptance in Western scientific, cultural, and religious bodies. However, evidence for reincarnation is continually being experienced or reported throughout the world, a fact that has caused some scientists to reevaluate and explore the validity of this body of evidence. Examples include spontaneous past life recall, as well as biological connections between successive lives, hypnotic past life recall, and reported cases of xenoglossy, which means speaking in a foreign language for which one has no prior experience. Given this body of evidence, it becomes increasingly difficult to discount the possibility of reincarnation, especially since all that would be required to prove reincarnation exists would be to find a single case of definitive evidence. This mimics Dr. William James's famous observation that one does not have to show that all crows are black in order to defeat the law claiming that crows must be black. Rather, it is enough merely to find one crow that was not. The late Dr. Ian Stevenson, former professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, was one of the world's premier scientists in this regard. Dr. Stevenson researched children worldwide who talked about having memories of their former lives. During his career, Dr. Stevenson assembled more than 2,600 case studies, many of which were published in exhaustive tomes that included in-depth discussions of his research methodologies to aid academic peer reviews of his research and conclusions. One of Dr. Stevenson's harshest critics was, ironically, himself. Despite spending an entire career focused on researching phenomena that continually pointed towards the validity of reincarnation, Dr. Stevenson never accepted the precept of reincarnation himself, but rather allowed that some of his case studies seemed to indicate evidence was quite suggestive of reincarnation. Dr. Stevenson claimed some type of flaw, no matter how minor, existed in every case he investigated, which prevented him from being willing to declare any of the work over his entire career could definitively prove reincarnation. However, he did admit the body of evidence was growing in quantity and quality over time, thus increasing the plausibility of the concept of reincarnation. I would suggest Dr. Stevenson was overly humble at the quality and implications of his work and findings. Indeed, much of his casework is widely quoted by other authors on the subject, and many of his cases in this genre seem stronger than merely suggestive. However, only a tiny fraction of those cases will be highlighted here to give you a taste of Dr. Stevenson's work. Dr. Stevenson felt it was particularly appropriate to research children in regards to spontaneous past life recall because children were too young to have acquired any preconceived notions about reincarnation. They were also unlikely to have substantive information about the deceased person they reportedly recall when that person lived in another location. Additionally, the occurrence of delusions and psychotic conditions in children is rare, thus virtually eliminating the possibility of hysterical dissociation or split personality disorder on the child's part. Also, in many cases in which a child in Western society remembered living a previous life, the family often found such claims to be a baffling and unwelcome event that was not condoned by their Christian-based culture. Therefore, a child's verbal recollections were often met with active dissuasion, reprimand, and even scolding by parents who do not wish to take the child's statements seriously or have neighbors, friends, or other family members know about and potentially ostracize the family because of the child's culturally unacceptable claims. Dr. Stevenson found if a child was going to speak about memories from a spontaneously recalled past life, the child nearly always began doing so between ages 2 and 4. In most cases in Dr. Stevenson research, the child continued to talk about the previous life until somewhere between ages 5 and 8, at which time the memories gradually began to fade, and the child began to focus on his or her current life instead of the past life. Many times these children would recall the manner in which the previous personality had died, particularly if the death had occurred following violent circumstances. This memory in particular could aid Dr. Stevenson's research to identify the previous personality and then verify the manner and circumstances of death and other aspects of the recalled personality's life against the child's proclaimed memories. Jagdish Chandra was born in Uttar Pradesh in northern India in 1923. When Jagdish was 3 years old, he began speaking of a previous life he had lived in Benares, another Indian state. Intrigued by these stories, which were culturally acceptable to most people in India, Jagdish's father began keeping written notes of the boy's memories. Jagdish claimed he had 2 sons and a deceased wife, and that he owned an automobile, which was a rarity for Indians at that time. Jagdish further described his mother, his so-called real father Babuji Pandri, and some family relatives, and provided explicit details of his former home, including the location of a safe hidden in a wall in an underground room at their residence. Jagdish Chandra's present father located the so-called former family and his father, Babuji Pandri, and took Jagdish to Benares to meet him. Babuji Pandri tested Jagdish's proclaimed memories by asking the boy to direct him to his former home as they walked through the maze-like streets of Benares. Jagdish did so despite having never been there before, and even pointed out the secret safe hidden in the wall. Jagdish also recognized some relatives he had known in his previous life and displayed a detailed knowledge of the specific religious and dietary customs of his former family. Dr. Stevenson noted these recalled memories were from a very young child who lived far from the location of the recalled past life and in a separate caste system, so that his current family, neighbors, and associates would also have had no natural exposure to information about the previous life or customs. Most of Jagdish's claims proved true upon investigation, and the child also exhibited behavioral traits appropriate for the previous life. As with all of Dr. Stevenson's cases, however, the professor was reluctant to claim sufficient evidence was present to serve as definitive proof that Jagdish was Babuji's deceased child reincarnated. Kumkum Verma also began speaking about a past life in India at age 3. Kumkum recalled living as Sunari in a neighboring town. She also recalled being married to a man in the blacksmith caste, as well as having a son named Misri Lal, a grandson named Gaurishankar, and 2 daughters-in-law, one of whom had caused her death by poisoning her food. Kumkum described Sunari's home as having a pond near the house and an iron safe hidden inside that she kept secured by harboring a pet cobra near the safe. Interestingly, Kumkum also exhibited no fear of snakes as a child, and had once even stroked a cobra that had fallen from a tree near her. Kumkum further described an orchard of mango trees near Sunari's home, and claimed Sunari's father had lived in the town of Bajipur. Kumkum's aunt carefully recorded Kumkum's memories as Sunari, though her parents dismissed the stories for some time. Kumkum repeatedly asked to return to Sunari's home in Ubu Bazar, but her parents initially refused. Finally, at age 4, a friend of Kumkum's father had occasion to follow up on the story's details and located Sunari's son, Misri Lal, in the city of Urdu Bazar, as well as Sunari's grandson, Gauri Shankar. Misri confirmed most of the claims made by Kumkum about his mother's life, including her death following a sudden unidentified illness, though at the time he had suspected his mother had been poisoned. Unfortunately, relatives had dissuaded him from performing an autopsy, so there could be no confirmation concerning Kumkum's claim that Sunari had died of poisoning. Much of the other information that was confirmed, however, was obscure personal information that would only have been known by immediate family members, so there was no logical explanation for how a 3-year-old in another town who had never had contact with their family could have known such information, including the location of the hidden safe and a house where Kumkum had never personally visited. Shanti Devi was born in Delhi, India in 1926 and began describing memories at age 4 of her previous life as Lugdi, a woman who had lived in Mathura, a town some 80 miles away. Lugdi had died the year before Shanti Devi was born from complications during childbirth. Shanti Devi's memories of the birthing process seemed quite unnatural for a child of such young age to conceive, and caused her parents to pay particular attention to further descriptions of Lugdi's recalled life. For example, Shanti Devi also described various benign aspects of Lugdi's life, commenting on her home, garden, husband, children, food, etc. By the time Shanti Devi was 8, people were taking her story seriously. Upon request, Shanti Devi provided the name and address of Lugdi's husband, and an inquiry found the man did indeed live where Shanti Devi had claimed, and his previous wife Lugdi had died in 1925, a few days after the birth of their son. When they met, Shanti Devi's recollections of her previous life as Lugdi and the emotional reaction she had upon meeting Lugdi's son, only 1 year older than Shanti Devi, his reborn mother, convinced all present that Shanti Devi was Lugdi reincarnated. When Shanti Devi later visited Mathura, She directed the driver to Lugdi's home, pointed out several landmarks on the way, recognized and identified Lugdi's parents and other members of her family, and described how Lugdi had hidden 150 rupees under the floor of their home. Lugdi's husband admitted he had found the hidden rupees and removed them after Lugdi's death. Altogether, Devi made at least 24 correct statements about Lugdi's life and apparently gave no incorrect information. Quite uniquely in this case, Shanti Devi retained her memories of Lugdi's life and maintained a personal conviction that she had lived this past life throughout the entirety of her own life. Shanti Devi died at age 61 in 1987. Like Dr. Stevenson, extracerebral memory investigator Hemendra Banerjee investigated more than 1,100 spontaneous past life recall cases during his career, including the case of Romy Crees, a toddler in Des Moines, Iowa, born in 1977, who claimed she was actually Joe Williams, a husband of Sheila Williams and father of 3. Romy described in graphic detail her death as Joe from a motorcycle accident and exhibited a phobia of motorcycles. Dr. Stevenson found that phobias almost always corresponded with the manner of death in a person's remembered previous life, and occurred in about 1/3 of his case studies. If a phobia manifested, it would occur before the child had begun to speak, and would tend to diminish as the child grew older and forgot about the details of the past life. Romy recalled attending school as Joe in Charles City, a small town approximately 140 miles from Des Moines, Iowa. Romy recalled that Joe had lived in a red brick house and provided descriptions of Joe's mother, including the fact that she had leg pains, had burned her hand following a fire caused by Joe, and that she liked blue flowers. When Banerjee and Romy visited Joe Williams' 76-year-old mother, the woman was quite disbelieving of the little girl's story until she correctly identified everyone in a family portrait that had been taken in December 1974. Joe Williams and his wife had both died in a motorcycle accident in 1975, and his last present to his mother had indeed been a bouquet of blue posies. Joe's mother also confirmed that she had leg pains, had burned her hand from a fire caused by Joe, and many other details that Romy provided, which finally convinced her personally that Romy was not lying about being her deceased son, Joe. Professor Erlander Haraldsson of the University of Iceland investigated the case of Dilukshy Nisanka, who was born in Sri Lanka in 1984. At less than 2 years of age, Diluksy started talking and began describing a previous life she had lived near Dambulla, some 80 miles from her own village. She made about 30 statements concerning this previous life, including the circumstances of her death. By age 5, Diluksy had finally impressed upon her family the need to check the validity of her facts and visit the area where she had remembered living previously. Diluksy led her family to her former home at Dambulla, some 4 miles from the town proper. Dilukshy's definitive statements of her previous life as Shiromi and her emotional reaction at recognizing former family members and objects in the family's home caused her former family to recognize her as Shiromi, their former daughter, who had died from drowning. Professor Haraldsson concluded at least 12 of Dilukshy's statements about Shiromi's life were definitively proven, while some others may have been near hits or near misses, with variances attributed to the inexact quality of language translation or changes to area scenery that may have occurred over time, thus hindering the process of proving statements referring to historical descriptions that could no longer be confirmed. Amongst the more than 2,600 case studies Dr. Ian Stevenson researched of spontaneous past life recall were at least 225 case studies of possible correlations between a child's birthmarks or birth defects with the child's memories of past life events of physical trauma. Dr. Stevenson's book, Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, summarized 112 of these cases. The birthmarks in these cases were not similar to normal moles. Instead, they were usually hairless areas comprising a mass of puckered scar-like tissue, generally raised above or depressed below the surrounding tissues. Some were even bleeding or oozing as open wounds when the baby was born. Dr. Stevenson was particularly interested in the potential correlation between these types of birthmarks or birth defects because they might be able to prove an objective type of evidence to show the validity of reincarnation. Birth defects, for example, may be caused by genetic disorders, toxic chemicals ingested during pregnancy, uterine conditions, or even certain infectious diseases like the Zika virus. However, A large number of birth defects still have an unknown cause, ranging in frequency from 43% to 70% of all birth defects that cannot be otherwise explained. Thus, birthmarks and birth defects that correspond with the location for where a child specifically recalls being critically wounded in a past life might be able to suggest that the deceased personality either influenced or was associated with the later born baby. This could potentially help researchers understand why, at least in some cases, people may exhibit unique birth defects at certain locations. Typical of the evidence Dr. Stevenson collected in this regard were more than 200 birthmarks on children who claimed to have been killed by bullets or bladed weapons that pierced the corresponding parts of their bodies in the recalled previous life. Of particular import were 17 such cases in which Dr. Stevenson was able to review medical documents, such as hospital records or autopsy reports, which established the past life individual had indeed died in the manner recalled by the child, and the mortal wounds corresponded with the location, size, and shape of the birthmarks or birth defects of the child being studied. The following are a few extremely brief examples of the more than 200 cases that Dr. Stevenson investigated that highlight this particularly important body of evidence. Nasruddin Shah was born in a poor Muslim family in a small village in Uttar Pradesh, India in April 1962. Nasruddin's father was a poor day laborer. Nasruddin had several birthmarks, the most prominent of which was a lens-shaped birthmark on his left chest. When Nasruddin began to speak as a small child, he described a former life he recalled living, and even seemed to have difficulties differentiating between his current and recalled past life. Nasruddin claimed definitively he was a Thakur, the second highest ranking caste of Hindus in India. He also asserted he lived in Fargana, a nearby village. Nasruddin stated his name was actually Hardev Baksh Singh, and recalled experiencing death when a spear was thrust through his ribs on the left side of his chest, the same point as his birthmark, and this occurred during a fight over cattle. Nasruddin's statements, including those above and many others, corresponded exactly with the life of a man named Hardev Baksh Singh, a Thakur landowner in Fargana, India. Hardev had indeed become involved in a quarrel over some cattle. The fight soon became violent, and his adversary drove a spear through Hardev's left upper chest, killing him. The autopsy report provided to Dr. Stevenson confirmed the correlation between Nasruddin's birthmark and the location of the fatal spear wound and Hardev Baksh Singh. Further remarkable in this case was Nasruddin's Thakur-like behavior. Even though Nasruddin was born and raised as a Muslim, he always considered himself to be Hindu. He also thought of himself as one of particular distinction, as might be expected of one in a high-ranking Thakur caste. For example, Nasruddin refused to participate in menial labor activities, such as collecting cow dung used for fuel, which most poor village boys in India undertook to support their families without question. He also resisted acceptance of the Islamic religion and would not say Islamic prayers or go to the mosque with his family. Nasib Unlu Takskiran was born in Adana, Turkey in 1951. As a young child, Nasib claimed his real name was actually Nasib Budak, and he stated he lived in the city of Mersin, about 80 kilometers from his home in Adana. Nasib recalled his death from his previous life being attributed to stabbing, and each of his prominent birthmarks corresponded with locations he recalled being stabbed in his former life. Nasib also recalled leaving children behind in his former life and begged his mother to take him to see them. Nasib's grandfather eventually took the boy to Mersin, where Nasib accurately identified several members of Nasib Budak's family. They further confirmed the accuracy of Nasib's statements about the life of Nasib Budak. Nasib Budak had been repeatedly stabbed with a knife and died of his wounds at a hospital, where the wounds were noted in an autopsy report. Dr. Stevenson compared the autopsy report with Nasib's birthmarks and remarked of his findings that Nasib's case exceeded all other spontaneous past life recall cases where biological indications of reincarnation were present, and for which supporting medical documentation was available to study and make comparisons between the wounds of the deceased and the birthmarks of the living. Further remarkable in this case was Nasib's admission that his previous personality had stabbed his wife in the leg, leaving her with a scar. Nasib Budak's widow admitted the truth of this statement and provided visual confirmation to some of Dr. Stevenson's escorting females in a private back room during their investigation. Hanumat Saxena was born in Uttar Pradesh, India in 1955. Hanuman was born with a large birthmark on the lower part of his chest near the midline. The birthmark was irregular in shape and included a pattern of several similar birthmarks situated close to one another. When Hanuman was about 3 years old, he began talking about a past life he recalled living, in which his name was Maharam. Hanuman recalled being shot in the chest as Maharam and pointed to the location on his chest where the birthmarks were prominently located. Dr. Stevenson and his team of researchers discovered Maharam was born and lived in the same village as Hanuman, and had lived from approximately 1905 to 20 September 1954, when he was fatally shot in the chest by a shotgun at close range. The autopsy report showed nearly exact correspondence between Hanuman's birthmarks and the shotgun pellet wounds that had killed Maharam. Hanuman Saxena made further statements that proved to be correct about the life of Maharam, and when he visited Maharam's home, he recognized family, friends, and places that had been familiar to Maharam. Hanuman continued talking about his previous life as Maharam until he was approximately 6 years old. However, he also liked visiting Maharam's house and mother, who still lived there, and continued doing so until he was 10 years old. Delal Bayaz was born in Samandağ, Turkey in July 1970. Delal had a substantial birthmark on the crown of her head that oozed for days after her birth, like an unhealed wound. As a young girl, Delal described having lived a previous life in Kavash, about 30 kilometers from Samandağ. Delal recalled her death in that life as having occurred while she was hanging clothes out to dry along a clothesline on the roof of her house, when she stepped backwards and fell through a hole in the roof. Delal's statements closely matched the life and death of a woman named Zahidi Kose, who had died as described by Delal. Zahidi fell through an unprotected stairwell while hanging out clothes, landed on her head on the concrete floor below, and died of her wounds. Dr. Stevenson confirmed the fatal injury and location through a review of Zahidi's medical records, which corresponded closely with Delal's birthmark and location. Maung Hlaseong was also born with deformed hands and feet in Burma following World War II. When Maung first began speaking, he did so in an unknown strange language as reported by his Burmese parents, but later he began to speak Burmese. When Maung was almost 3 years old, he started describing a former life he recalled living in Japan, and he frequently asked to be allowed to return to Japan. Maung also displayed mannerisms, preferences, and characteristics that were typical of Japanese, but not so for Burmese, such as a preference for long trousers instead of the Burmese longi, a preference for sweet, spicy foods, insensitivity to pain, a tendency to be cruel, and role-playing as a soldier, all of which were an oddity for his family and Burmese culture. Maung recalled his death as a Japanese soldier and claimed mutinous soldiers in his own unit had tied him to a tree and chopped off his fingers and toes. Hypnotic states are normal everyday states of consciousness, typified by concentrating on one sensory input, such as a hypnotherapist's instructions, to the exclusion of other sensory inputs. Examples of everyday hypnotic states of mind include daydreaming and even watching television. During these periods of attention, our attention is concentrated or transfixed on one item specifically, and thereby our awareness is turned inwards. The same as occurs during hypnosis. Being a normal experience, hypnosis is not dangerous and indeed is often used for therapeutic purposes. Hypnotherapists have found that therapeutic effects can be realized by seemingly regressing people to an earlier time in their life in order to help them recall memories of a point in their life where they had experienced a trauma. While in a safe, benign environment and under the guidance of a trained therapist, a hypnotic subject can again face troubling issues from their point of origin, and by doing so often achieve positive resolutions and closure to overcoming phobias, trauma, and other concerns that may have plagued them for years. Using conventional hypnosis to regress clients back to childhood memories to work on long-term issues, many hypnotherapists in the 1960s experimentally stumbled upon what appeared to be memories of their clients' past lives because the memories could not otherwise be rectified with their current life experience. During a past life regression, the subject only needs to be in the lightest alpha brainwave state of altered awareness, the same as a normal hypnosis session. This can be achieved through a light hypnosis induction, which normally takes 10 to 15 minutes, although meditation or other personal techniques of inwardly focusing one's thoughts on past life memories can also be used to similar effect. Whether or not the memories recalled during these past life sessions were legitimate, clients often achieved amazing therapeutic effects from them, which further encouraged hypnotherapists to incorporate the procedure into their regular programs. Indeed, many therapists found that some of their clients who had failed to respond to conventional therapy treatments, lasting many years' time, often made dramatic improvements following only a few sessions of past life therapy. From these successes, pioneering therapists, many of whom had medical credentials, began assembling a large case file of evidence from which to begin drawing conclusions regarding the possible validity of past life recall through hypnosis. The late Dr. Helen Wambach, one such researcher, noted of the unique character of past life hypnotherapy sessions that clients who experienced the past life during hypnosis tended to experience deeper and more intense levels of emotion than mere visual imagery alone. For many hypnotic subjects, the emotional level of the experience imparted more meaning to them than the intellectual component. These recalled emotion-linked experiences seemed to be more real than mere dreams. They were intense, and at least for the client, had meaning. The meaning may be expressed through emotive statements or crying and tears, and subjects under hypnosis tended to have an increased feeling of certainty about the accuracy of their reporting. Thus, when they reported they experienced death by drowning, for example, they re-experienced the death event and its unique pain as if for real. However, after re-experiencing the death event under hypnosis, most patients were able to overcome their fear of drowning, for example, seemingly because they were able to recall from whence the fear had originated, and the mere fact of doing so had allowed the fear to resolve itself. In contrast to spontaneous past life recall, during past life hypnotic regression, clients may show striking changes of speech, behavior, mood, and emotion. They may claim a convincing sense of vividness and proclaim certainty as they express memories of being in other locations and periods of history. They may speak with foreign accents and even foreign languages, or alternately be able to write in a foreign language. During past life recall, the client will assert they have different names and identities and may even claim to be of the opposite sex. Most often, they display a trove of information that is surprisingly appropriate for the personalities and times they claim to be remembering. After helping hundreds or even thousands of patients to experience a past life during a hypnotherapy session, many hypnotherapists have wondered whether there was any truth or validity to the hypnosis-induced recall of these past lives. Of note, hypnosis allows the subject to experience enhanced recall, known as hypermnesia, perhaps through their focused effort of concentration and the power of suggestion while in the hypnotic state. However, researchers have found this enhanced recall increases both the client's level of certainty of accuracy in the reporting as well as the amount of information provided, but does not necessarily increase the accuracy of provided information. An increased precedence of accurate recall is generally counterweighted by an increased number of errors as well. Thus, hypnosis is not a true serum, so past life accounts obtained during hypnotic regression should not be accepted at face value or as 100% accurate. Still, there have been many hypnotic past life regression sessions that have produced unique information that is proven both impossibly accurate and completely obscure, such that it would have been impossible for the client to know the provided information through any normal means. A number of these cases have been infinitely investigated to ensure no fraud was involved and the information was indeed both obscure and accurate. Of past life hypnotherapy cases, hypnotherapist Joe Keaton, who has conducted hundreds of past life regressions, believes that only about 2 in every 100 regressions may not be the product of imagination and fantasy and thereby deserve special consideration. Special note will be applied to a few of these well-documented cases shortly. However, as a genre of information to consider, here are a few more reasons to take the idea and genre of past life hypnotic recall seriously. First, few people are aware of Dr. Raymond Moody's groundbreaking research on near-death experiences, so it should be expected that a good number of hypnotherapy clients would also be unaware of the near-death experience phenomenon. When clients are hypnotically regressed back to previous life and are taken through the death and departure scene again, the description of those clients' experiences at death match on par with the reported statements of people who have experienced a near-death experience. For those persons without prior knowledge of near-death experiences, this limits the normal opportunities a person under hypnosis would be able to recall a piece of information acquired through normal means, such as reading, watching television, or hearing a similar account from others, and then projecting it as their own recalled experience. One must wonder then how a person would acquire this information unless he or she was actually recalling through the aid of hypnosis what had actually occurred immediately following a past life. Second, pure fantasy has little part to play in hypnotic past life recall. Subjects under hypnosis do not tend to recall past lives as kings or other famous persons. Indeed, most lives are boring, unglamorous lives, typified of the lowest class of society, which is, after all, the largest percentage of the population throughout the history of mankind. Dr. Wambach studied this phenomenon and reported on the statistical significance of past life recall as being preferential to investigating the merits of any singular case. In particular, she was troubled by the idea one could plausibly fantasize under hypnosis about being born and dying as an infant or young child. Surely a more reasonable fantasy would include riches and fame. However, Dr. Wambach knew that the incidence of infant mortality approached 50% in both primitive societies and during past centuries before modern medicine increased the odds of survival for both children and childbearing mothers. Therefore, statistics insisted if past life recall under hypnosis had any basis in fact, people must indeed recall instances of living as a child who died before the age of 5, which was indeed borne out in her research. And third is the subject of xenoglossy, which will be discussed in more depth shortly. Briefly, though, xenoglossy refers to an ability to speak a foreign language, usually while under hypnosis during a past life recall session, and for which the person has had no prior exposure. This is a powerful level of evidence that may lend special credence to the phenomenon of past life recall under hypnosis, though the incidence rate of xenoglossy is exceptionally low. Still, in the words of William James, these white crows need not be numerous. They merely need to exist to lend exceptional validity to the idea of reincarnation. And fourth, there is a repetitive and commonsensical character of past life reviews that emotes its own influence on the researcher. In 1950, English psychologist Dr. Alexander Cannon, who had used hypnotic past life regression on more than 1,300 clients in his practice, admitted that for years the theory of reincarnation had been an anathema to him, and resultantly he tried his best to disprove the idea at every opportunity. He even argued with his clients while they were under hypnosis in an attempt to make them admit they were speaking nonsense about the recalled experience. Over the years, however, he eventually realized these stories remained consistent no matter the client's personal or religious beliefs on the topic of reincarnation prior to the hypnosis experience, and after investigating more than 1,000 cases of past life recall, he finally admitted to himself that there must be such a thing as reincarnation. Past life psychotherapist Dr. Linda Tarazi conducted exhaustive research on one of the so-called white crows, hypnotically regressed client Laura Dillman, a pseudonym. Dillman volunteered as a member of a group to be the subject of 8 past life sessions between June 1977 and January 1978, during which she recalled a former life as Antonia Michaela Maria Ruiz de Prado, born November 1555 on the island of Hispaniola as the daughter of a Spanish officer, Antonio, and his German wife, Erica. During these sessions, Dillman, an American who did not speak Spanish and had never visited Spain, provided significant and highly specific information about this past life memory, upon which review by Dr. Tarazi proved to be entirely true. Seeking to gain better fidelity of the possible validity of this hypnotically recalled past life, Dr. Tarazi convinced Dillman to undergo a further 36 past life regression sessions between June 1981 and March 1983. The purpose of these later sessions was to seek even more highly specific details that could help prove or disprove whether this past life memory was based on fact or fantasy. With Dillman's memories of these facts in hand, Dr. Tarazi embarked on an exhaustive search for errors and inconsistencies in Dillman's memory that involved hundreds of hours of research in 24 libraries and universities, as well as consultations with historians, archivists, and university professors who specialized in Spanish history for that period, and even a personal visit to Cuenca, Spain, where Dr. Tarazi was able to examine the town's archives and historical Spanish Inquisition records. Based on this research, Dr. Tarazi verified more than 100 facts from Antonia's story, many of which were quite obscure. Dr. Tarazi concluded at least 50 of Dillman's reported facts concerning the life of Antonia could have been easily discernible through consultations with history books or encyclopedias. Another 30 facts, however, were only discovered with significant difficulty in rare books found in specialized research libraries. Further, over a dozen facts were only published in Spanish, and a few facts were not even published at all but could be confirmed from the municipal and diocesan archive records in Cuenca, Spain. Of the more than 100 reported facts of Antonia's life, none proved to be false. Some examples of Dillman's reported facts about the life of Antonia included the following. Of significant interest, two of the facts were initially not supported by archival authorities in Spain, but upon further research, eventually proved to be correct. The first was the location of the tribunal of the Inquisition in Cuenca, Spain. Dillman described it as a castle standing above the city of Cuenca. However, the government tourist office in Cuenca provided a photograph of the Inquisition's building that differed from Dillman's description. However, Dr. Tarazi found an obscure history book on Cuenca, published only in Spanish, which revealed the Inquisition had moved to the castle in Cuenca in December 1583, 5 months before Antonia's arrival in Cuenca, which fit her description exactly. The second was a reference to a college at Cuenca, for which no other reference was seemingly available to confirm. After much difficulty, however, Dr. Tarazi found a century-old reference, again only in Spanish, which quoted yet other obscure Spanish sources from the 16th century that described a college that was founded in Cuenca in the mid-16th century. A third oddity that stood out from the history books was that although there were normally 3 inquisitors at a tribunal, Dillon had mentioned only 2 having been present. Dr. Tarazi found the Episcopal archives in Cuenca noted that during the period 1584 to 1588, the entire period Antonia lived in Cuenca, there had indeed been only 2 inquisitors present at Cuenca. Dr. Tarazi concluded that, considering the number of sources and the sheer obscurity combined with the inherent difficulty of extracting the pertinent information from those sources, it seemed improbable that Dillman could have acquired all of the information through some duplicitous means. When the fact that some of these sources were in a foreign language that Dillman could not speak and only located in a foreign country where Dillman had never traveled, then the chances dropped to the realm of impossibility. Dillman did indeed seem to be a so-called white crow. Past life psychotherapist Peter Ramster conducted exhaustive research on another one of these white crows, hypnotically regressed client GM, an Australian woman who had never traveled outside of Australia. Under hypnosis, GM recalled living as Rose Duncan, a young woman who was born in Somerset, England in 1765 and died of pneumonia in 1782. Under hypnosis, GM provided many facts that could be checked concerning Rose's life and her recalled historical period in England, including descriptions of the area, buildings, towns, and villages, daily life and clothing, and certain verifiable personalities in 18th century England. After researching as many of these facts as possible in research libraries in Australia, and some other resources that were available via phone call, such as historians and archivists, Peter Ramster conducted a fact-finding mission to England, accompanied by GM and Dr. Basil Codall of Bristol University in the UK. As was the case of Antonia, Rose Duncan's case produced facts that proved to be both amazingly obscure and accurate. Ramster found that some of the villages that GM recalled no longer existed, but could be confirmed on older maps of England. Other details of GM's hypnotically recalled life were confirmed in England in museums, historical libraries, and in the unpublished parish records of Somerset, England. For example, GM had repeatedly referred to a tale from a previous life, a word not referenced in any modern dictionaries. However, in the Library of Taunton in Somerset, England, a dictionary of obsolete West Country English words noted the word was used specifically during the time period and location of Rose's life and meant a room under a roof, such as a loft. The word was no longer used and indeed had never been used anywhere except in the West Country of England. This information showed GM had used the otherwise unknown word correctly while under hypnosis and referring to Rose's recalled life. GM also made frequent mention of a particular abbey near Rose's home in England and its surroundings. GM described the abbey as being surrounded by marshy ground. GM's descriptions of the abbey and surrounding area, even those that were no longer immediately evident, later proved true, including certain prominent paving stones, as well as hills and other features that were used by historical druids in the area. For those items that were no longer present for verification, Ramster found pertinent evidence in a historical manuscript on the subject printed in England around 1794. Further, GM's description of the clothes worn by the druids that frequented the area between 1775 and 1780 and the way they filed up a nearby hill in a spiral line was confirmed by Geoffrey Ashe, a local historian, though the mere fact that druids had assembled in the area of Glastonbury had been unknown even to Dr. Codall, a university historian from Bristol. GM also described an establishment known as the Pilgrim's Inn, situated near a humpback-shaped hill she had called Wearyhall Hill. Ramster eventually found an inn of equivalent description that was now known as the George and Pilgrim. and ascertained it had been known as the Pilgrims Inn in the 18th century. While visiting the location, described as Rose Duncan's former home, GM pointed to the spot where she claimed 5 houses used to stand, one of which sold cider. An area homeowner confirmed 5 houses had stood on the site but were torn down 25 years prior, including one that had been a cider house some 150 years prior. Subsequent to this discussion, Ramsey consulted an 18th century survey map of the area and found 5 houses were indeed annotated at the location GM had identified. Finally, GM also recalled a neighbor of Rose Duncan's who had stolen some paving stones from the local abbey and then used them as flooring material in his cottage. GM noted the neighbor's cottage, which has since been turned into a chicken coop. During an inspection of the chicken coop, Ramster found hidden beneath a thick layer of dirt and bird droppings stones that matched those found at the abbey. Under hypnosis in Australia prior to the trip, GM had even described and drawn the stonemason's markings for the stolen blue-gray abbey stones that were indeed found in the chicken coop located on the other side of the earth from GM's home in Australia. The markings were described as 3 vertical lines on the top left-hand corner and a large spiral on the right-hand side of the stones. Once again, personal inspection proved GM's hypnotic recollection of Rose's memories were accurate. Ramster concluded that GM's ability to find a specific stone, drawn months prior in Sydney, and attributed to and found in a location in a country she had never visited, was a feat far beyond the element of chance. The term Xenoglossy was originally coined by Charles Richet and means an occurrence of speaking a language without having prior knowledge of that language. There are 2 subcategories of xenoglossy, including recitative and responsive xenoglossy. As with the more familiar term, speaking in tongues, recitative xenoglossy involves the use of spontaneous phrases or passages of a language, but an inability to understand what has been said, or to understand questions in the foreign language, so as to be able to respond with answers in the same language. Responsive xenoglossy refers to a more important subcategory that will be considered here, which is an ability to converse intelligently in the otherwise unknown foreign language, and implies an understanding between the subject and questioner during the period of responsiveness. Because native fluency and command of a language requires practice, repetition, and generally some period of immersion, an authentic case of responsive xenoglossy would provide important evidence of the survival of human consciousness after death and the transmittal of that consciousness into a new life as a logical means to explain how such command of an otherwise unknown foreign language could have been passed from one life to another. Past life researchers rarely obtain even cursory evidence of xenoglossy, however. The late Dr. Helen Wambach noted only a very small percentage of people are able to respond well enough to hypnotism to write or speak in a foreign language from one of their past lives. Dr. Paul Cunningham further discerned subject-centered hypnosis have a slower rate of speech, use fewer words, and have longer periods of latency than comparable subjects in a normal waking state, which may further explain the complaints many naysayers propose concerning xenoglossy, which is that even if a person speaks in an unknown language, he tends to use few words and may have a slow, disjointed pattern of speech. This phenomenon is noted in many of the case studies below, and is used as a common example by naysayers and as to why the few hypnotically induced xenoglossy cases that have been published do not seem overly credible. Therefore, I will reserve judgment at this point and allow you to come to your own conclusion as to the validity of this piece of evidence or its applicability to reincarnation. Uttara Hudar was born in Nagpur, India in 1941. Between 1974 and 1979, a split-bass female personality that called herself Sharada Chattopadhyaya spontaneously manifested and took over Uttara's body for periods between 2 and 43 days at a time. When Sharada first manifested, she did not realize she had died and returned in another person's body. She also did not recognize Uttara's friends and family, and provided details of the names and places in Bengal with which she had been familiar as Sharada. Uttara, who spoke only Marathi, suddenly spoke fluent Bengali with a native accent during the periods that Sharada assumed control of Uttara's body. Dr. Ian Stevenson and his team of investigators found that Sharada's Bengali was free of all English loan words and had more Sanskrit words than did modern Bengali. Bengali of that description would typify the language as it existed between the 18th and 19th centuries. Sherrod was also unfamiliar with electrical appliances, gas stoves, fountain pens, or modern vehicles, which had all been developed after the Industrial Revolution, signifying Sherrod likely lived between 1810 and 1830. Dr. Stevenson lent this case of Xenoglossy extra credibility as a possible case of reincarnation, because if Uttara had fraudulently learned Bengali, then she would have acquired a modern version of Bengali and not the language as it had existed 150 years prior. Jensen Jacoby was a male personality manifested by a 37-year-old American housewife under hypnosis during 8 sessions conducted between 1955 and 1956. Jensen spoke Swedish, which the American housewife could not. Indeed, she had never even been exposed to the Swedish language. Dr. Stevenson's investigation concluded there was no mundane way to explain the woman's ability to speak and respond in the unfamiliar foreign language while hypnotized and speaking as Jensen. Jensen would generally respond in English to English-initiated questions and in Swedish to Swedish-initiated questions. A transcript of these sessions showed that Jensen used approximately 60 Swedish words in conversation before Swedish-speaking interlocutors introduced the words, and about 100 Swedish words altogether. While Jensen's Swedish grammar was not perfectly fluent, the pronunciation was judged by some authorities to have displayed a native Swedish accent. This seems important because in order to adopt a perfect accent, one must be exposed to the language for an extended period of immersion, generally from a very young age. Dr. Stevenson added that in order to converse in a language, one must practice it, which also implied that the Jensen personality had used Swedish during its prior lifetime. However, Dr. Stevenson was still hesitant to definitively connect Jensen's possible prior life to the American housewife's current life as a definitive case of reincarnation. While not a normal case of Xenoglossy, Christian Friedrich Heineken, known as the Infant of Lubeck, reportedly talked within a few hours of his birth in 1721. The King of Denmark was intrigued by the young child's feats and had him brought to Copenhagen for inspection in 1724. Shortly thereafter, the child fell ill and predicted his own death within the year. He subsequently died at age 4. An ability to speak at birth implies far more than mere genius talent, but rather a pre-existing ability to speak, as the ability must have originated from somewhere. Such might be possible through the manifestation of a prior personality, and that personality's itinerant language capability manifesting unduly early in the newly incarnated baby. Rather than choose a single past life subject to study in depth and determine whether the revealed facts corresponded with the historical record, the late Dr. Helen Wambach chose to study a large group of hypnotically regressed subjects and then examine various common phenomena from their past life experiences and compare the incidence of the group's reported phenomena to known statistics from the historical periods in question. As previously noted, Dr. Wambach did not trust subjects under hypnosis to produce minute details that would stand up to intense scrutiny, but felt there was unique validity in the emotions and, more importantly, the metadata, or general impressions of her clients' and test subjects' experiences. For example, even though 78% of her first group of hypnotically regressed subjects was female, the group as a whole recalled past lives with a sexual distribution that was roughly divided 50-50 between male and female. Indeed, throughout all of her study groups, Wambach found that regardless of the sex her clients had in their current lifetime, they split perfectly into 50.3% male and 49.7% female lives when regressed to their past lives. This is almost exactly what the historical record would demand, regardless of the time period, and showed there was little influence by fantasy, which would have tended to provide past life memories of the same sex as the subject recalling the life. Dr. Wambach felt this finding was the strongest objective evidence she had discovered during her extended experiment and led her to conclude her subjects were actually tapping into some real knowledge of the past. In addition to sex distribution, Dr. Wambach also compared her subjects' recollections of their wealth and status, as well as their race, clothes, footwear, food and eating utensils, money and supplies, population, and death experiences. In regards to the former, Dr. Wambach found less than 10% of the population of past life recall subjects recalled a past life as a member of the upper class, whereas 59 to 77% tended to recall past lives as members of the lowest class. Dr. Wambach questioned if past life recall was merely fantasy, then why would a person choose to fantasize about such mundane and harsh lives? Dr. Wambach found of the average 7% who remembered upper class past lives that their memories of these lives were not usually considered to be particularly pleasant experiences. The stressors and drama unique to the upper crust, political leaders, and wealthy were quite unpleasant memories for most, whereas some of the happiest lives were ironically lived by those peasants and primitives. 5 of Dr. Wambach's subjects described themselves as wearing pants in the Caucasus Mountains around the year 2000 BC and having white skin and light-colored hair, none of which they accepted as plausible according to their own view of history. However, Dr. Wambach's later research showed their subconscious had actually presented them with a more accurate picture of life in the Caucasus Mountains around 2000 BC than their conscious awareness would accept as valid. Dr. Wambach concluded that when our hypnotic experiences of the past life contrast with preconceived notions of the truth and yet hold up under close scrutiny, then we should consider the idea that past life recall is only fantasy. The mode of death recalled by Wambach's subjects also matched closely with the expected mode of death for each of the time periods measured. As a median, 55 to 73% of recalled deaths were due to natural causes, while 12 to 17% were due to accidents, and 13 to 24% were due to violence, depending on the time period studied. The death experiences that Dr. Wambach's subjects recalled also matched closely with the template identified by Dr. Raymond Moody's research on the near-death experience. Dr. Wambach further concluded of this that the universality of the recalled death experience suggested that prior knowledge, such as through near-death experience research, could not account for the level of agreement and reporting between all of her subjects. While some may have read Dr. Moody's books, certainly all had not, and yet they all reported a uniform death experience similar to that found by near-death experience researchers. Further, Dr. Wambach found to her surprise that her clients consistently reported that death had been the best part of the past life hypnotic recall experience. Not only did her clients report the process of death was pleasant, but they realized an intense feeling of relief when their spirit was released from the body and gained complete freedom once again. Her clients were no longer afraid of death, having experienced this phenomenon. Consider for a moment a few passages in some of the world's most influential religions that could only be interpreted as supporting the concept of reincarnation. For example, in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, he writes, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Unless this warning is interpreted as fallible, then it proclaims strongly of the concept of rebirth, because one life is plainly insufficient to prove this assertion to be correct, and indeed is equivalent to the Eastern religious idea of karma. The same could be noted of St. John's Revelation, which he stated, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword." Now, given the fact that many soldiers have died quietly in their beds of old age, this statement would be robbed of any meaning if not for the possibility of future retribution in a subsequent life, where one who had previously killed, with a sword or otherwise, could then be killed in a similar violent manner. The same argument can be extended to any other violent act humans commit against one another: rape, robbery, murder, or any such injustice. Not everyone who rapes will be raped in their lifetime. Not everyone who murders will be subsequently murdered. However, the possibility of subsequent lifetimes to experience the consequence of prior sins would certainly allow these passages to bear out truthfully. Still, such a cut-and-dry interpretation of karma should not be interpreted as an impossible and never-ending cycle of retribution of one's past sins. Dr. Michael Newton concluded from his thousands of hours of work studying pre- and post-life examinations of subjects through their interlife period that the essential purpose of reincarnation was self-improvement, not retribution for past crimes. Russian past life therapist Varvara Ivanova noted that specific difficulties would crop up continually in successive lifetimes until one learns how to overcome the adversities they are continually facing in life, such as jealousy, rage, or insecurity, for example. Thus, if one wants to rid oneself of the current difficulties they are facing, the surest answer is to face those difficulties head on and deal with them right now in the current life, no matter how temporarily painful such a course of action may seem. If one hopes ever to break out of the cycle of reincarnation and having to face the same problems over and over, such action can only be accomplished in the present point of the here now. Dr. Newton also found that souls accept a compact with the universe upon acceptance of a new life on Earth, and as such, they will not generally remember the previous lives on Earth, or even the true connection to the Oversoul and life in the spirit world. This is because learning from a blank slate is better and more meaningful than knowing in advance what could happen as a consequence of one's actions. Similarly, if people were cognizant of their past deeds and mistakes, they might pay too much attention to the past rather than trying to figure out new approaches to similar problem sets to apply to their current life. The new life must be taken seriously, as if it were one's only life, and thus considered by a human to be his only chance to experience all that is, and to solve those issues that it faces in the here and now. That certainly seems to be the most plausible explanation for the phenomenon of reincarnation to me. When a child spontaneously recalls a past life, invariably because of a traumatic and violent death, the recalled life is due to the emotional residue left with the spirit and carried over between lives. A veil of amnesia is part and parcel of the so-called compact with the universe, and usually prevents souls from recalling their previous lives, but is imperfect in these cases because of the power of the emotional residue from the traumatic death experience. The fact that emotional energy could also affect the next life through carried over birthmarks and birth defects from prior wounds shows the power of that energy. In the cases of Japanese soldiers reborn as Burmese slaves, one is given a unique insight into the workings of the universe to see, at least limitedly, how a previous karmic debt might be repaid in the next successive life. In these cases, Japanese soldiers who had abused Burmese natives during the course of their assignments in the country were given an opportunity to live as the natives they had abused in their prior life. The debt was related to, but not exact in that they did not live as the Burmese natives they had abused during the same overlapping time period. Beyond emotion-induced cracks in the veil of amnesia, the process of hypnosis can focus conscious attention into the subconscious and even superconscious states, providing a person unique access to their previous lives, even if those memories are imperfect recollections or possibly even amalgamations of multiple lives, thus limiting the exacting nature of the recall process. Dr. Wambach found it was exceptionally rare to be able to recall foreign languages using those lives well enough to use them in a responsive manner, but the mere fact that a few case studies existed showed that the phenomenon was possible. To further rectify the findings of this section, consider Dr. Wambach's metadata findings to be quite significant, and that is that information gained through metadata and emotions are the most significant, readily accessible, and relevant data sets that can normally be gained through research on all clients' hypnotically recalled past lives. While some data may indeed be accurate, perhaps eerily so, the process of hypnosis does not increase the accuracy of reporting, so should not be considered a true serum for the current life, much less for past lives. Only a few exceptional specimens are able to tap into their subconscious deeply enough to be able to speak or write in a foreign language using one of those previous lives, and likewise only an exceptional few could tap an unimpeded fountain of true facts from those past lives that could stand up to intense scrutiny. Therefore, it is less reliable to dispel an entire genre of potential evidence simply because every reported fact from a previous life does not prove correct under exhaustive research. Rather, the metadata from those lives should be explored for applicability and utility in research to determine whether reported lives are plausible or could aid scientific research on an issue. It should not be surprising, therefore, that spontaneous recall produces fallible results and facts, perhaps even more so given the absence of directed consciousness as is achieved under hypnosis. Still, the genre of research provides its own unique support to the subject of reincarnation and is likewise supported by the metadata and emotions experienced and recalled by the children subjects who experience spontaneous recall. Like hypnotic recall subjects, 100% correlation between remembered facts and the ground truth is unnecessary for those cases to have significant merit as already argued. A takeaway from this section might be that one should reconsider their former notions of prejudice against those who are not like themselves. Indeed, I found through later research discussed in the second half of my book that the average soul has lived hundreds, if not thousands of lives on earth, and likely has lived as every race, sex, nationality, religion, and other discriminator that has ever existed. Therefore, hating one who appears different than you is akin to hating your own self, since we have all been like that person in another life, for whatever purpose our karmic debt or oversoul had required at that time, or will require in a future lifetime. Further, there is always the karmic concern that to hate another today, or who they are, may actually incur a karmic debt of living one's next life as a subject to one's current wrath, in order to better understand the feeling of being discriminated against. Consider this. The genre of reincarnation research is full of stories of former Nazi soldiers being reincarnated to live their next life as Jews so that they could better understand the unique issues of the people they had previously mistreated. If one hates something intensely in this lifetime, the chance exists of having to live as the subject of that hate in a future life, perhaps to gain a better perspective of the issue as a developing and experiencing soul. A final takeaway should almost assuredly not only mimic Dr. Wambach's finding that death was pleasant, but that death was most certainly not an end, but rather a continuation of life with a subtle movement from one chapter to the next. Indeed, this knowledge in itself may provide the internal courage one might need to face one's challenges now, to make the hard decisions needed to overcome a persistent fear or life challenge given the reality that death cannot hurt one's actual existence. Imagine what you could do, for example, if you could put aside fear. Assuredly, all of life's stressors come from some form of fear, and the drive to avoid or overcome it, like the fear of death, fear of ridicule, or fear of competition, etc. If you can put aside those fears, there might be no limit to what you can achieve in this life or the next. From this higher soul-based perspective, the nagging fear of death can be put aside and replaced with an acceptance that life holds the opportunity for spiritual transformation if we are ready to accept the challenge now. Thank you for staying with me through this entire introductory video series. I hope you got something out of it and will continue to explore these issues for your own developmental needs. If you'd like to explore further the scientific findings of reincarnation or other topics discussed in The Hidden Truth, I invite you to download a free copy of the first half of my book from our blog site located at the following URL. The full book is available for sale on Amazon.com and continues in the next chapter with a discussion on the evidence concerning what happens during the period of time between our lives, our life between life. I hope you enjoy the journey.